This is a great interview between Joe Rogan and Stephen Meyer, but I think most people have overlooked the significance of this dialogue. We have two people who have different beliefs, both trying to answer the most significant and meaningful questions of life. So I'm glad you're here as we're going to unpack this conversation quite a bit. And as we unpack the significance of this dialogue, I want to know what you think. What are the significant things that stand out to you in this interview? So let's get into it.
Sort of deeper.
Is this an egocentric perspective because we are alive? Is it our perspective of life being far more significant than other things in the universe, like the creation of suns? Is this thing that we have where we're attaching intelligent design to something that may just be a property of the universe itself?
We could say that, except that we know that fine-tuning in our experience does result from mind. It's not just that we're interested in
our experience.
Yeah, in our experience.
But limited experience, right? And
right, but that is the basis of all scientific reasoning.
Right. I understand, but it's not a conclusion based on all the data that could possibly be available.
No, that would be to have that would be a certain proof.
Right.
Okay.
So to have this sort of certain proof, this is a really interesting question from Joe Rogan, and it kind of presupposes that we could potentially have like proof, and that idea is thrown out there, and it needs some clarification, because in order to have proof, in order to have like metaphysical certitude, I'm absolutely certain that God exists, you would have to have all knowledge of all things. So no one has proof. Atheists don't have proof. Theists don't have proof. Everybody believes what they believe with a degree of faith. And I don't even know that it's so much like these people over here have more faith and these people over here have less faith. Everybody's on an even playing field when it comes to faith. The real question is, what kind of faith do you have? Do you have a faith that is just a blind kind of, I'm determined to believe this thing? And I think that's kind of what Joe is trying to get at with Stephen is, are you kind of conditioned to come to these conclusions when you look at the evidence, or are you being objective? Which is a good question. We should all be asking ourselves that question. But that's the kind of faith that's sort of more like an ideological commitment. There's other people who just trust, their mind and what they can see, taste, and touch, and nothing beyond that. Sort of like a materialistic approach to things. And then I think the Christian kind of has both in a way. And the other people as well. I don't want to, I speak from a Christian perspective, so that's kind of my, that's where I'm coming from. I can't really speak for other people, but what I see in my own faith is, I hope to kind of have both this commitment to understanding and using my mind and making a wise decision based off of the evidence, but also realizing that my mind is limited. I have a finite mind, and so I will never have proof in that sense of certitude, absolute certainty that this thing is. I do think Christians, well, I guess maybe you could go with the three monotheistic religions. You can, kind of focus it down from there if you want to, but Muslims, Christians, Jews all believe that God has revealed himself. And that is a stronger position to be in, I think, in that we're not talking about what humans can achieve with their own rationality. So we just said that the reason, rationality is limited. So what we would need is, if God exists, we would need outside knowledge to come in and reveal the truth about who God is to us, and not just people trying to make it up. So I do think that reliance on revelation is a stronger position to be in. And so that's really the playing field that we are on. And my sort of question maybe for Joe, if I was in the room, would be, well, what kind of evidence are you looking for when you establish a belief in something? Because certainly you're not waiting for certainty. Sort of an awkward way of saying that. But certainly you're not waiting for certainty, because otherwise you wouldn't believe anything. And so yeah, what kind of evidence are we looking for when it comes to this question? Do we think that life is the most significant thing just because we are living people? Is it sort of a self-centered view of reality? But of course it is. Like, we're the ones, like, suns are not personal. Suns are just objects in the cosmos. They're wonderful and magnificent. But suns don't sit there and wonder about their existence. Rocks don't wonder about their existence. People do. And so, yes, of course, we think that's significant. So I think that this is a good question from Joe Rogan. And I think Stephen does a great job. Throughout this whole interview, I think that Stephen, this conversation is fun. That's the reason I'm back at it. It's a good conversation. It's a fun conversation. It's meaningful. And that's the kind of thing that I want to perpetuate in this world of the internet that's oftentimes not filled with, meaningful things. So if you are here with me, welcome. I'm glad you're here. And as always, I do this to create dialogue. I'm not just Monday morning quarterbacking going, oh, this could have been said or that could have been said. That's not what I want to do. Critique is fine, but for the purpose of dialogue. So if you've got a thought and you want to leave it in the comments section, I would love to engage with your ideas as well. So thanks for doing that.
In your mind, are you certain?
Am I certain? I have had experiences of God that make me more confident.
Can you tell me those experiences?
Yeah, but can I make an earlier point? Because you're raising, it's awesome the amount of good philosophy you do on this show because of the way you ask questions. And this is the questions you just asked have lead to an answer that is right at the heart of deep philosophical discussions that have been going on for about 500 years. And there was in the Middle Ages there were these attempts to prove God's existence with absolute certainty, and they failed. And in the Enlightenment period, philosophers like Hume and Kant came along. Kant was actually sympathetic to theistic arguments, but he didn't think you could provide absolute proof. Yeah. But because you couldn't get proof, a trend came in religious thought that was called fideism. You just believed for no reason at all. You believe in belief alone. I have faith in faith alone. And you got figures like Kierkegaard who believed that you could know God, but you knew it entirely. You knew God entirely subjectively, and you just had to take a leap of faith. There was no rational basis for it. I think there's a middle way between those two extremes. Even in science, maybe especially in science, we don't get absolute proof of the kind that we get in mathematics. So you can get in mathematics where you start with a certain axiom, and then you make a series of deductions from that using deductive logic.
Okay, so again, just his point is that even in science, you're not dealing with this type of certainty. You have to make you have to establish your belief in something based off of the evidence that you see, knowing full well that you're not seeing everything that is. You don't know everything that is knowable. Yes, we could have future discoveries and things like that. But how do you live your life? Can you live your life out just suspending belief? No, you have to believe something, and your belief can be based on evidence or based on this just sort of leap of an irrational leap of faith, which I would say Christians get a bad rap for having that kind of faith, and they don't do a good enough job of demolishing that. And I think Stephen is doing a great job. It's like you're showing that there is a rational reason for why you believe and have this faith. That faith and rationality are not at odds with one another. They can come together. So, and that's true even in the scientific realm. So atheists, hang in there, okay? You realize that we all walk through life with a level of faith. The three tests of truth: correspondence, coherence, and then empirical adequacy. Can I live this out? If I believe that I don't exist, but then I go on living like I do exist, then I'm incoherent. I'm not, my belief is not strong enough to work its way into a coherent life that I move forward in and walk forward in, that allows me to interact with the world the way it is.
You don't get that kind of argument. Science isn't built on that type of logical structure. So science is always provisional. But we can have very good reasons for thinking things or believing things based on scientific evidence that we find. And I think the proofs for God, or the arguments rather, for God's existence are of that kind. They have strong provisional weight. They're like in a courtroom where you're beyond reasonable doubt based on what we know. So the two extremes are fideism, where we have no rational basis for faith, or rationalism with the claim that we can have absolute certainty about belief in God. And the middle way, I think, is this idea of what I call, we can make an inference to the best explanation. We have strong provisional evidence and arguments in support of belief in God.
All right, what do you guys think? Is that seems like a pretty well thought out kind of, he laid that out really well. What do you guys think about that? Is sort of theism, maybe even Christianity, for those of you who are Christians, is that kind of the best middle way? Is that a strong place to be? And is that helpful for people that are wondering about these things? Wondering about, like, if God exists, or maybe I need to make an adjustment in my beliefs. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, because I thought that's pretty good.
And so I think from a rational standpoint, as an intellectual, when I am asked, does belief in God make sense? I would say, yes, it makes sense in that sense. I think we have strong reasons for faith, but not absolute proof. So yeah, that's the first part. Then just experientially,
yes.
Yeah.
Strong reasons for belief in God, but not absolute proof. Yeah, we have strong reasons to believe. Hopefully, we have strong reasons to believe anything. Our search here is for truth, wherever that might lead. For me, that led me to Scripture, led me into contact with Jesus, and Stephen's going to go into that here in a little bit. But I felt like that's a good statement. To me, that's a healthy way to kind of look at life. It's not comfortable. If you're from more of a rationalistic standpoint, you really want kind of proof, and you want clearly defined, this is the way it is. And it's not always comfortable to live with a little bit of suspense that I may not know. I don't know everything, so I may not be correct. I may be a little off here. And the truth is, we're all a little off. We're all a little off from the truth. We all miss it a little bit, which again goes back to my belief that we need revelation. The only person who has an accurate view of reality, who knows truth perfectly, is the God who created all things. And we would be in a desperate situation if that God had not revealed himself to us. Thankfully, I think we're in a place where God has revealed himself to us. So onward and upward. Here we go.
Well, I don't think this is unique to people who have religious belief, but one of the things that the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament talk about is the role of the Spirit of God, or the Holy Spirit, that what is objectively real in history is made subjectively real, or confirmed subjectively, by the testimony of the Holy Spirit. That's something that I have experienced in different ways, and so I have an inner confidence about my faith in God.
Right. Well, how have you experienced it, though?
I have heard non-audible voices, the things I don't hear audibly, but words that come into my head that I am immediately aware are not generated by my own thought processes.
How can you be sure?
Can't be sure. Except
why do you believe that?
Well,
because the imagination is so fertile.
It is fertile, Joe.
Well, and again, he already said that it's confirmed objectively by the evidence that he just laid out over the last hour and a half, and then it's confirmed subjectively by this internal sort of witness of the Spirit. So those two should be consistent. They if what's confirmed internally is different from what I can sort of establish objectively from the evidence, then what is it internally that needs to adjust to the objective evidence that I'm seeing? That would be the kind of thing. So of course he doesn't. It's not proof, but it's part of the package. It's part of a cumulative case that you might make for faith.
And so you have to test these things. But I've had, it's only happened to me a few times, but they've been words of guidance about the direction that my life is going to take or needs to take. And they have guided choices that I've made, and they were very distinct, very strong. And when I've developed almost a sense of humor about it. I've learned over time. I mean, I overthought everything as a young person, going back to like everybody.
Person.
Yeah. And so I used to be really annoyed at these Christians who would say, God told me, what on earth are you talking about? I mean, I can look at the biblical witness. I can compare it to the historical evidence. I can look at these things we've been talking about in science. But what are you saying, God told me? But I think there is an experience that many people have over time walking in faith, where they begin to recognize the voice of God in their own life in a more personal way. And for me, sometimes it's been with a sort of double entendre, where there's a passage of the Bible to which I've been drawn for some, maybe something a completely random reason, but at a particular time where I realize, oh, that's kind of funny. That has a direct application to this situation that I'm in. And then I find that, sure enough, that was actually insight or guidance into what I was about to experience.
But people have gotten that from philosophy as well. They've gotten ancient philosophy.
And again, I'm not making any argument on the basis of this.
But you were talking about an experience with God.
I've had,
Do you think that qualifies as an experience with God? Isn't that just a human moment relating to the revelations and things that other human beings have discovered? And as a human, we are constantly absorbing the ideas and the revelations and the observations of all of us, of what we've learned about the human experience, what we've learned about how our own unique biology interacts with the world around us, how we can relate to that. It's not that alone itself is not an experience with God.
I agree with.
But the question is, and I know I'm interrupting, it's hard, but the question, listen to what Joe just laid out there. Is that just coincidental, or is that the way we're designed? Are we designed to be that way and to have these sort of awareness of other things? Or is that just random? I think if you just, that's just the way it is, it's just written in nature and nature is random, then you don't have a very good explanation for why certain testimonies like this would happen either. You may not like the idea that God orchestrated it. Okay, that's fine. But what's the alternative? It seems like the alternative would be kind of lame. You may think God as an explanation is lame, and that's fine. Glad you're here. But just being sort of written in nature and nature is random and that's just our experience, to me seems like sort of gymnastics that people do when it's like, I really don't like the idea of God. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to say, this is the way things are. This is the way things are, but without explaining how did we get there? How did we get to this place where this is the way things are? My answer is God created it that way.
With all that, and because this is what I'm relating are subjective experiences, I would not place any weight on them in trying to persuade anyone else of the existence or reality of God.
Mm-hmm.
I have a hard time with that. Our testimony is powerful, so there is weight to it. The testimony is powerful. It's not a apologetic. It's not a philosophical argument, so I get that. And it seems like Stephen is more comfortable just sort of laying out his philosophical arguments. And now that he's getting into the personal side of his faith, it's hard for him, and that's fine. That's totally fine. It's all hard for all of us, but there is weight to it. Scripture says that our testimonies are powerful. Okay, there was war in heaven. Michael and his angels were waging war with the dragon. Again, this is in the Bible. The dragon and his it's in the constellation. It's up here. You can read this. I actually did a video on this. Michael Heiser unpacks this as far as the constellation and all that's going on in the heavenly realm in the sky at this time. So he's referring to the dragon, the enemy, and the great dragon was thrown down, the serpent of old, who is called the devil, Satan, who deceives the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. And I heard a loud voice in heaven saying, "Now the salvation and power and the kingdom of God and the authority of his Christ have come, for the accuser of our brethren has been thrown down, who accuses them before our God day and night. And they overcame him because of the blood of the Lamb and because of the word of their testimony. They did not love their life even when faced with death. So the power of your testimony is able to overthrow the enemy, the accuser. I mean, with the blood of the Lamb. Blood of the Lamb first. Blood of the Lamb first. And then the power of your testimony. So again, isn't that sort of what Stephen Meyer is talking about? There's this objective reality, the blood of the Lamb. We as Christians, Jesus is real in space-time, really came into human history. So there's this objective thing that happens. And then there's this more subjective thing, my own witness, my own testimony of coming into contact with the risen Jesus. Those two things come together in this sort of cosmic battle that we're talking about. And so, again, not trying to Monday morning quarterback here with Stephen. I think he's doing a great job. I just don't know what the resistance is here in... Well, I guess I understand the resistance here. He feels like the philosophical arguments are stronger, and he's aware that his own personal testimony seems a little weaker. It's not as strong, let's say. It's more subjective, and so it puts him in a little bit of an uncomfortable position. But I think Joe is genuinely curious. Joe is genuinely curious to hear his story, and he actually did this with Matt Walsh. Again, so I think Joe is curious, and we'll look at this Matt Walsh clip here in a second. We'll just do a little clip of it.
I wrote the book I did in a completely different vein, on the basis of objective evidence.
What religion do you study, if you don't mind me asking?
It's not so much. I'm a Christian.
You're a Christian?
Yeah, I'm a Christian.
Right.
I actually like that Joe doesn't even know that Stephen is a Christian. Well, maybe not. I don't know. What do you do with that? Joe invites him on. He's a theist. He knows that he believes in God, but he doesn't know like that Stephen is a Christian. Is that should that be more overt from a Christian standpoint? Should that be more evident in the way you do life, or is it kind of just like, yeah, I'm just going to invite this guy on. We're going to talk about God. I don't even know. He could be Muslim. He could be Jewish. He could be a Christian. He could be Hindu for all I know. Like, let's just get him on and talk about God. And then it comes out that, oh, this guy's actually a Christian. We're an hour and a half into the interview.
Here, I'll give you the thing that I first experienced upon my Christian conversion was an experience of peace that I'd never had before, and an experience of outward-focused love and concern for other people that was completely and is completely contrary to all my natural inclinations. Why I would suddenly feel love for a stranger on the street or be concerned about a friend in a way that I had never experienced before, I could not explain that on the basis of my own selfish inclinations.
Can I pause you?
Yeah.
Isn't that a part of the philosophy of Christianity? And when people go into an ideology, when they adopt a predetermined pattern of thinking and behavior, that's very common to do. And that is one of the beautiful aspects of Christianity. Those thoughts, that philosophy.
For all the Joe Rogan haters out there, I mean, just listen to that. That's a pretty objective statement. He said that's one of the beautiful things about Christianity. Joe's not a Christian, but he can acknowledge that. Credit where credit's due.
This would be something that you would adopt because now you have meaning, you have guidance, you have purpose. You are now a part of a group. And being a part of this group has a very beautiful philosophy on other human beings. And you would adopt that. And that would give you great pleasure from that. But that's not necessarily an experience with God.
Not necessarily, I agree. But there is a difference between knowing what you should do based on Christian moral teaching and actually having, for the first time ever in your life, having an inclination to do it.
Yes, but you're a young, I understand, but you're a young, impressionable person looking for guidance, and your life is not so good before this. You're not so
good
happy.
at all. Not so good at
happy.
all. Yeah.
So then you find something that gives you meaning and gives you focus and gives you this beautiful philosophy to change the way you think, and you adopt it wholeheartedly, like young people are inclined to do, or like anybody that's looking for change in their life. Anybody that's looking for something better is inclined to do.
Yeah. So what Stephen is touching on is this kind of like transformation, right? Sort of this outside working. There's real transformation going on in his life. Now, can people be transformed going into other religions. Sure, but I think what Stephen is touching on is deeper than that, and I don't think that they get to this because I don't think he ever uses the word sin, but it would be that the old man, the sinful nature, is being transformed, and I'm actually having new desires that are totally contrary to who I know I am personally, and I actually just appreciate his honesty there, Stephen's honesty there about his own internal struggle there. But he's pointing to a genuine transformation, not a surface level transformation, and even like a profound transformation that some people can have who join just any kind of religious organization. Some of those experiences can be profound, but the real overcoming of the depraved, sinful nature that resides inside of all of us as humans, that's something else. That's something that maybe should be highlighted a little bit more in this conversation. I think this is a great part of the conversation, and I do apologize. I know I'm pausing it and I'm interrupting it, and that can be difficult, but obviously I will link this in the description, and you can watch the full thing if you want. But I just think that they're touching on some really good. This is kind of the heart of some of why it's the heart of some of what makes the Christian gospel message good news and powerful and a powerfully transformative force in people's lives, and has been for thousands of years. We can't overlook that.
It's a natural pattern of growth. It's a natural pattern of recognizing there's a better way, and you seek out that way.
Sure. I mean, that'd be an alternative explanation. I experienced it in a way that convinced me that something more than myself and my thinking was responsible.
So what he's saying is it wasn't a natural growth pattern. Sorry, I interrupted again. Back to the podcast.
Isn't it beneficial to think that way, though? It's beneficial in adopting that philosophy to think that way. And if you think that way, you're rewarded, and you are inside of this philosophy that does have these beautiful tenets to it, that does have these beautiful ideas.
Sure. I mean, I would not place any weight on my experience in trying to persuade someone else of the truth of theism or Christianity.
Right.
I have a lot of other arguments that I would place weight on, because I think we all have internal experiences, but this was such a dramatic thing, and persistent concern for a given friend that I am aware is hurting. Not what is in my natural my natural inclinations towards selfishness are still very much in evidence every day, right?
But isn't that part of the human survival mechanism? I mean, there's a lot of natural inclinations that people have towards selfishness if they're not treated correctly when they're young, or if they encounter bad experiences.
Yes, they are naturally inclined towards selfishness. They are not naturally inclined towards selflessness. Okay, so if evolution is the explanation, at least that many atheists that I know and interact with would kind of like take this as, how did you get here? Well, it was this process. Well, nature is written in tooth and claw. I mean, nature is brutal. Nature is the survival of the fittest. And if you want to look at the subtext to Darwin's book, I mean, it's kind of spooky. It's the preservation of favored races. That's the subtext. I mean, he was working with some presuppositions that everyone would say, well, that's wrong. That there would be other humans who are less evolved. Okay, so that's maybe an aside. That's maybe a conversation for another day. But to Joe's point, if evolution is our explanation, then there is no explanation for selflessness or self-sacrifice, which is one of the tenets of the Christian religion. You shouldn't sacrifice yourself for other people. You should do everything you can to perpetuate your own genetic code further. So the fact that so the scenario would be like parents giving up their lives to save a child. They from an evolutionary standpoint, they should not do that because they could always have more children. So and if they sacrifice themselves for that child, then they've wiped out their genetic. That's it. They won't be making any more children, and it's up to that kid. And yet you can see how beautiful it would be, and harsh, but that there is some redemptive quality to that story if it is an evolution, if we are created in God's image. And so to live self-sacrificially, again, is consistent with the way, with what we experience in reality. So it's revealed to us by God. We can establish it objectively through evidence that Stephen is building up, and then we have this personal connection to it. There's a contact point with the actual person of Jesus that is transformative, that allows us to live self-sacrificially. I think that's a beautiful point. Man, I do wish that Stephen would have not been. I wish that Stephen would have been a little less hesitant to share his personal experience, because again, I think Joe is really interested in that. And again, if I have time, we'll look at this Matt Walsh clip, because he asked Matt Walsh the same questions, and Matt Walsh kind of gives the same answer. He's not comfortable talking about it. I don't know why.
And then when you encounter good experiences, and now you can relax and you can be a part of something that's bigger and better.
Yeah, don't know. I mean, I'm prompted to pray for someone, then learn later that that person is experiencing some extreme difficulty. Don't know why I suddenly felt that. I mean, there are
you care
these
about
things,
them.
I care about them, but I didn't know that they were. In any case, I think this could be somewhat unproductive, because I'm completely willing to concede your point that
It's definitely not unproductive. It's
well,
interesting.
Good. I just mean that in the sense that I don't think that I could persuade you to be a theist or a Christian on the basis of my personal experience. I would concede that, because there's always.
Well, I'm not asking you to do that, though.
Or anyone else.
I'm asking to find the underpinnings of yours.
Yeah.
I want to find your origin story, right? So that's
I
it.
love that.
So I'm trying to figure out what, and I could see why adopting that thought would be very comforting, and I could see why adopting that. I mean, that happens in cults, like.
Okay, well, before we go into the cult thing. I really appreciate Joe Rogan here. He's like, I want to hear your story. I want, this is, it's not unproductive. But you can tell that under that, Stephen is saying, well, these aren't really helpful for the purpose of convincing you or winning an argument. And, it's unfortunate that maybe he sat down with Joe kind of with that in the back of his mind. If you just sit down with Joe, I mean, his podcast is about having conversations. You just sit down with Joe and have a conversation. You're not trying to persuade somebody. I think if you do that, you might persuade more people. I don't know. But I think, for any Christians out there, if you're learning from this interview, this dialogue, I think that would be a takeaway. That would be an important takeaway to consider. It's not really my job to persuade people. It's my job to present the reasons for why I believe what I believe. And I think I have good reasons for that. I think those are convincing. It might lead to good conversation. It might even lead someone to change their beliefs about certain things. I planted, Apollos watered, but God causes the growth. Our job is to plant seeds, water seeds, and let God produce fruit out of those seeds. And I think, unfortunately, in sort of Christian apologetic circles, the winning of the argument or the persuasion gets highlighted a little bit more than just the ability to have a good conversation. Can we just let's push that a little bit more? So Sean McDowell, if you're watching, let's push that a little bit more. The ability to have a good conversation maybe is the goal of Christian apologetics in our modern day. But okay, so there we are. There we have it.
This is I bought a building that I was going to convert to a comedy club, and it was owned by a cult before I had it. And this cult, there's a documentary on it. It's called Holy Hell, and the cult. It was called the Buddha Field. They existed in West Hollywood, and they made their way out to Austin. And the guy who ran it was a very charismatic guy who was also a hypnotherapist and a gay porn star. And this guy had these people convinced that they had extreme meaning being with him, and it meant so much to them that they were willing to sacrifice the rest of their lives, and they were going to travel with him no matter where he went. And he would do these things to them where we'd have them, and he would impart upon him what he called the knowing. and it was a very difficult thing to get. He had to choose you for it, and people waited years. But when they did have that experience, it was one of the most overwhelming things they'd ever experienced in their life. It was like a days-long psychedelic experience where there was no drugs involved. It was merely him with this ritual, this thing that he would do. He's put his hands on their head, and there's videos of these people, like, in orgasmic ecstasy, experiencing love and God in a way that they had never before. This was real to them.
Does that remind you of any churches that you might know? Hopefully not in a bad way, but really interesting.
But it was a cult. It was a guy who was a scam artist, who was a con man, who was a hypnotist, and knew how to manipulate people. And ultimately, the result was terrible.
Right.
These people lost 20 plus years of their lives, and
probably a lot of money in the process.
And so, but they believed that because of that personal experience, because they were guided. They did not have a good life. They were not happy. Now all of a sudden they found purpose.
Right.
They were part of this group, and there was this guy, and he had the answers to everything. He's this deity type figure, and he said that he was God, and they were all God, and it was all this beautiful experience, but it wasn't.
But it wasn't. See, this is where, so Stephen is saying there's sort of rational evidence that we combine with our experiential witness of the Holy Spirit as a Christian. These people had the experience that was profound, but it didn't line up with the evidence, and it didn't line up with reality. So I get it. And this is probably one of the reasons why Stephen is a little bit hesitant to share his story, because it does sound a little crazy. Christians start telling people, oh yeah, I heard a voice. I heard the voice of God. And you realize, ooh, yeah, that does sound a little crazy, And so you're hesitant to share those things because it sounds like this cultic type of behavior. But of course, cults have always followed the Christian religion. You can think of the early Christian Gnosticism that took place. I mean, that stuff was wild as well. So it's not necessarily anything new. And so it's the job of maybe Christian people to live a life that would allow you to be distinguished from those cult people that are being deceived into something, because otherwise you kind of sound like one of those. You kind of look like one of those. And I know I've brought this up in previous episodes, but it just keeps ringing in my ears is Ephesians 6:12. I mean, there are forces in the world, and there are spiritual forces that are kind of at war. Like, you can be deceived in this world, and unfortunately, there's even people who professing to be Christians, probably faithful Christians who can be deceived by this. This cult actually sounds like the cult that my aunt fell into. I mean, she grew up Catholic and, went to Catholic school and all that stuff, and found her way into a cult. I might have to do a little bit of research and see if that's where my aunt is. So if you're out there, love you. So yeah, I mean, it's horrible, but it does happen. It does happen. And what distinguishes the Christian person in and amongst a world of all kinds of different beliefs and all kinds of kind of wacky, strange things? I'd love to get your feedback on that, but for me, it's that coherence, correspondence, and empirical adequacy, the experiential relevance that I can live this out in my life consistently with what I see in the world.
It was manipulative. It was him figuring out a way to hijack the human brain.
Manipulate
and that
their
there's
emotions.
things in the human brain
right.
where you can convince the human brain that it's having an experience whether it has it or not. That's what hypnotism is all about. If you're a young person and you're looking for some meaning to life, you can work yourself into a frenzy where you believe you have this experience with God.
Yeah, well, a couple things to say about that. One is that I think it's one of the beautiful things about Christianity is that there is an interplay between the subjective experience of the individual believer and the objective witness of God's actions in time, space, and history, and that that people are enjoined to check their experience against objective criteria, so that And I think Jesus famously said, you will know the tree by its fruit." If in the case of the cult, it had a horrible outcome,
But not for
over
the
time.
first few years.
No,
Looks
I know.
like they were
but-
having a good time.
Yeah, so I think these things do have to be tested over time. In my own experience, because I tended to overthink things, because I was annoyed at Christians who talked about their personal experience without being able to explain to me in any kind of on any kind of objective basis why I should consider their faith, I tended to be very either distrustful or skeptical about subjective experience, or overthinking in a way that would almost crowd the possibility of such experiences out. So I didn't really have many of the. As a young convert, I didn't have a lot of that. These things sort of crept up on me over the years, and I have become more confident that in some cases, in addition to the sort of general guidance of Christianity as a religious philosophy, there have been occasions in my life where I've experienced what I thought were pretty clear instances of specific guidance towards specific courses of action or choices I needed to make. And again, I wouldn't put any weight on that for anyone else, but it has been part of my experience in that sense.
Well, I could say the same about my own life.
Of course you could. Of course you could.
I have many, many moments where I felt like I was guided. Many moments.
Cool.
Well, and I wonder too if there's a difficulty in explaining your experience to anyone. I mean, you can imagine somebody who has gone off to war, let's say. You can think of World War I, World War II, these protracted, really horrible wars. And what would it be like to come home from that and then somebody just say, well, what was your experience like in the war? If you weren't there, you have no way of understanding. You have no way of understanding that person. I think it's similar. That's the struggle that right now that's going on. Is Stephen as a Christian is trying to explain to Joe, a non-Christian, what the witness of the Holy Spirit is like. And it's like if you have never witnessed, if you have never experienced God's Holy Spirit in your life, I don't know that I could help you understand it. It's one of those things where it's like, what does it feel like to ride a bike even? How do I explain that to somebody? But, the interesting one would be like if Stephen was relating his experience with ayahuasca or DMT, it's likely that Joe would be a little bit more receptive to that and be like, yeah, okay, that's great. That's, okay. Because of course, Joe has had those experiences. I don't know about ayahuasca, but I know he's talked about DMT before. And so even then, like if someone who has not experienced DMT, how would he explain that to somebody? And wouldn't he feel like it's a little bit hard to explain my experience with DMT to someone who has not experienced DMT? And that's just somebody's experience on a drug, basically. And we're trying to talk about someone's experience with the God of the universe indwelling them. It's going to be hard if you have never experienced it. It's going to be hard. It's going to be hard to understand that. So, is that sort of a bias that maybe even Joe has, and of course we all have our bias. So there you go. I mean, Stephen probably has a bias. Joe has a bias. I have a bias. You have a bias. And I'm glad we're here together trying to work those out. So it's great.
I mean, that's that's why I didn't mean it as a critique of our conversation to say I don't think it's productive. I just say I mean that in a philosophical sense that. If you want to talk across a worldview divide and say, hey, here's my philosophy, here's my worldview, here, and you have a different worldview, if we want to have that great conversation, either one of us just appealing to our personal experience is not going to move the discussion towards greater understanding.
But you're assuming I have a different worldview.
Yeah. So he notes the great conversation. Here we are. Okay. If you're a fan of classical studies, I don't know if that was exactly a reference to the great conversation going on in classics, but here we are on a podcast, engaging with another podcast, perpetuating that great conversation. Maybe not so great, but we're operating in the same kind of vein as we're listening to other people share their experiences and sharing our own. So I just had to note that as a person who loves classics, had to note that.
Not assuming that. I'm just saying that in general.
I'm interested in your experiences. I just want to know how thoroughly you've thought them through.
Yeah. Well, I tend to overthink things, but
right.
Yeah. But
with a particular goal in mind, perhaps.
Yeah, I want to know the truth.
Right.
That's what I like about your show.
Yeah, but also you want a very particular truth that you seem to have experienced to be true. Like this experience with God, this experience with this sort of this frequency that you feel that if you achieve and you are on, the world works in a more harmonious way.
I think that's the Spirit of God right there. Stephen was just like so quick, like, yeah, I want to know the truth. I want to know the truth. Well, yeah. People, and it's funny because I started this podcast and I come at things from a Christian perspective, and so I do interact with people like exactly like this who say, well, as a Christian, you're just not being objective. It's like, no, I started out being objective. It led me to Christianity. So it's not like, oh, once Christianity has been adopted, you sort of close off everything else. No, it was a search for truth that led me to the person of Jesus. And it's just kind of ironic that the Bible calls him the truth. So I love that. You have a certain objective and goal in mind. You have a certain bias. Yes, my bias is towards knowing the truth. I want to know the truth. Yeah. That's a great moment. That's a great moment.
Yeah, I would say I'm not trying to conjure up something. It's just been something that has.
No one's accusing you of that.
Yeah. No. It's taken me by surprise sometimes that there's a subjective aspect to my faith that has seemed as real as the objective things that the scientist philosopher in me also regards as very weighty.
Well, I'm very glad that you have the courage to talk about that, because I think sometimes when people do deal in science, these things that are not, you can't weigh and measure, they seem like a sort of complicated thing to discuss. That's why I wanted to know,
it's part of the human experience, though, right? And we all have that, you know. And it's part of what I think is so unsatisfying about materialism as a philosophy, is that people do not actually, in their own personal experience of consciousness, if nothing else, believe that we're nothing but matter in motion. You know,
I think people tend to join groups, and if you're a materialist, and if you are there's a lot of people that adopt philosophies that mimic religions. Whether or not they're religions or not, they like even some social philosophies, some social trends, they mimic cult-like behavior. And I think these are patterns that human beings are inclined to take.
I think he's 100% correct. I think we are made for worship. We are made to worship the Creator. And when we have abandoned the Creator, we're lost. We're playing these games. You know, this is Nietzsche. God is dead, and now we have to invent sacred games. We have to light lanterns in the bright morning hours. There's no up or down left. And he's exactly right. So in the absence of worship, the one true God, then yes, people seek groups. They seek a worship-like experience. And so, yeah, that's the goal of, that is the good news. It is that you can be in harmony with God, and you can live a life dedicated to worship, which is what we're ultimately created for. Our ultimate end and our greatest satisfaction in life is to be in unity with our Creator in the act of worship that's only made possible through His sacrifice. So He came and did it for us. That's a group worth being a part of, I guess. I love that. I think he's right. I think Joe is onto something. He's observing something that's written in human nature. But then the question is, where does it come from? I think it came from our Creator. How would you explain that from a naturalistic standpoint? Is it just herd mentality? Or again, is that sufficient? It might be part of an explanation. That's fine. But is it sufficient to explain this desire towards worship that humanity has had? Look back to the most ancient sites that we have. They look to be centers for worship. Worship is key.
And I think there's very productive patterns that human beings are inclined to take. I think those are the ones that have succeeded over time, either because they are the most ruthless, and the most controlling, and the people can't escape them, or because they're the most productive, and people find that those things benefit them greatly.
Yeah, and I think one of the things, there is groupthink in all groups, right?
Yes.
And that's, I think, one of the things that you like to challenge on your program.
Well, I like to challenge in my own mind.
Yeah,
too.
yeah, exactly. I have a Darwinian debating partner who's a very good-natured soul, Michael Ruse, a British philosopher of biology. I think he's at Florida State still. He and I, over the years, done a number of debates. He's written a very important book in which he says that that evolutionary biology has functioned as a kind of secular religion for many of his colleagues. In that, it answers a very important, deep worldview question: what is the process through which everything else came? Where did life get here?
Yeah.
It answers a worldview question that religions also answer. And so we have in our network of scientists who have been challenging the comprehensive neo-Darwinian account of things. I already alluded to, I think, that the Darwinian process is a real process. They just don't explain everything, right? But in challenging neo-Darwinism, we have found that oftentimes the discussions get very, very hot. And many of our top scientists have been canceled or censored at prestigious places like the Smithsonian or Cambridge University or the Stuttgart Museum of Natural History. There's been and it's people outside the sciences often say, well, I can't make sense of that. I mean, isn't science the place where people are supposed to discuss competing ideas and theories openly? How do you explain this impulse to cancel somebody with an alternative view who's at that rank of science? And I think Ruse's book helps to explain that a bit. You know, that it's not just religious people who have religious beliefs. There can be beliefs that are functioning in a quasi-religious way for people that have a secular or materialistic or naturalistic worldview as well.
Yeah.
And I think we all have to guard against the groupthink that comes from having a closed system of thought and not being aware of the kinds of challenges that could be brought or alternative points of view.
Well, and I think that, what's often thrown out from the religious people is like, you guys are believing in myths and fairy tales, and you just, again, like Joe is saying, you just want this to be true. But again, we've sort of invented new myths and new fairy tales. I mean, the materialist looks at the world and comes up with simulation theory. Okay, we don't like the idea of God, so but we're okay with the idea of super intelligent aliens who seeded life on planet Earth. We're doing it. We're perpetuating the same types of thing. It's just some people are doing it under the guise of science and quote unquote provable fact, which we already said isn't the case at the beginning here. Everybody needs faith. Everybody operates on a level of faith. And that, science often, people that are ideologically committed to evolution, let's say as an example, act very much like people who are religiously committed to ideas. So again, we're on the same playing field here. The real question for me, at least in the back of my mind, is what kind of faith do you have? Is it the faith that makes sense of the whole world, or is it locked in just one box? Or like Stephen and Joe are saying, it's just you've found a community of people that agree with you, and with that is a sense of security, maybe, or you have a sense of resolution in a world that otherwise doesn't give you any resolve. Doesn't give you any resolution.
I think one of the things that I advocate in all my work is a method of reasoning that is used in the sciences, but also in philosophy, also in detective work. It's called the method of multiple competing hypotheses, or the method of inference to the best explanation. And it only functions well if you're open to considering the competing hypotheses. And so I just think that there's a philosopher of science that I really like from Italy named Marcello Pera, who says that science advances as scientists argue about how to interpret the evidence. And so I think that openness to competing ideas is crucial to coming to conclusions that you can put some weight down on.
Have you ever had someone debate you that you feel like had a very good argument against the things that you believe?
I have been in debates with more and less skilled people on the other side. I have had a general experience, a surprising and somewhat a common experience that has been somewhat surprising, that many of the people who have debated me about, for example, the theory of intelligent design, have come somewhat unprepared to debate the merits of what I actually have proposed or affirm or argue for. They have in their mind typically a kind of stereotypical, cartoonish version of a young Earth creationist in white shoes thumping the Bible from the American South or something. Not that I have anything against the American South. It's just that, there's the there's this Scopes trial stereotypes. And I once had a debate on the BBC with Peter Atkins, an Oxford chemist, one of the most prominent scientific atheists. And it's still up online. People can go listen to it. But almost everyone that has told me they've listened to it said he was debating a cartoon caricature of you and was not at all prepared to debate your actual arguments.
Yeah.
So I've had that happen a lot.
People just like to win.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
I have, without, there's good people on the other side.
Yeah,
I think, I
sure.
recently had a good conversation with Michael Shermer, who's, the well-known editor of Skeptic magazine, on your friend Brian Callen's show. It was a very good discussion. I've had good discussions with Ruse, a terrific astronomer at University of Washington, Peter Ward. My own approach to this is I love these deep origins questions. Where did we come from? The philosophical questions. And I feel a kind of kinship with anybody who loves those kinds of questions, even if they've come to a different conclusion about the answer to those questions than I have. So I tend not to view the people willing to have those discussions, call them debates, as adversaries, but rather as sort of co-belligerents in an exploration.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah. Listening to this, Joe has a few of those moments, a few of those kind of aha moments where he goes, yeah, that's a good way to put it. So I think, people that maybe don't appreciate Joe's side of this conversation, maybe Christians who feel like he's being too harsh, or even that I'm being too harsh on Stephen Meyer as we look at this, realize that there are those moments of those aha moments that Joe has. And for me, I think that this is just such a healthy take. Again, co-belligerence on a search for truth or quest for truth. I remember exactly how he said it, is that I think that this should be the heart and the attitude of Christians. You can think of Paul going into Mars Hill. He's talking to people from their point of view, from their perspective. He understands these people well enough. And I think far too often in the last couple of decades, Christians have just created their own echo chamber, and there's a type of language even that Christians use that is familiar within sort of Christian circles, but it's really strange outside of Christian circles. And so this sense that for me that my journey of theology is one that begins in humility, and humility takes you through it, because again, I don't have all the answers. I have a finite mind. And so I'm sitting down and I'm talking with somebody who's a new ager or something like that, and they explain something to me that's kind of like, oh, I had not thought about it that way. My goal we're both on this journey together. Of course, I think, I feel like I have come to certain things that I'll hold very dear as truth, and I will defend those things until someone gives me good evidence for not defending those things. But at the same time, realizing that I can learn a lot from other people, and that truth is the ultimate goal there. Again, not some ideology, not some religious dogma that you want to believe, but that truth is the goal. And you don't have to win people over to good theology first. That, I think, is one of the hiccups that maybe we have within the kind of the Christian circles. Is we all have bad theology. We all have imperfect theology. You could think of A.W. Tozer's quote, what comes to your mind when you think about God is the most important thing about you. And he goes on to say that, we all kind of struggle to have a really pure and whole view of God. And so we take that humility with us into these types of conversations, knowing full well that I can learn from anybody. I can learn truth from anybody. In my experience, it's that the more you have an honest quest for truth, the more you become sensitive to truth, and the more you pick up on it in other people who you might disagree with. And then, man, you can build those bridges, and that's beautiful. That's that's the power of dialogue, I think.
I tend not to think afterwards about who won and who lost. If the host gets good comments because it was a good discussion, I feel that's a win.
What I mean is, has anybody ever presented you with an argument that made you reconsider?
I've become progressively more confident in the position the longer I've examined it. When I started out examining it, I wasn't fully convinced. So there's been, for me, a trend line of greater confidence. There are more and less challenging arguments on the other side. The one that we hear most is intelligent design is not science. And I say, okay, well, that must presuppose a definition of science. What's your definition of science? And at that point, we usually get crickets, because this type of argument is used mainly to shut people up rather than to engage the merits of the argument on the basis of the evidence and the structure of the argument presented. They're called in the field, they're called demarcation arguments. The idea that there are, and this one is based on the assumption that if you're invoking a cause which is not materialistic, then it's by definition not science. Okay, well then let's call it something different. What I found in my PhD research was that when people investigate questions of a cause which is not materialistic, then it's by definition not science.
Well, and I think the Joe's question is an interesting one. Have you heard any arguments that sort of would have convinced you otherwise? And I guess, of course, the easy answer to that is no, because if I had heard those arguments, I would have a different position. But of course, I really do enjoy Stephen's interview. Obviously, this is the second, episode that I'm doing on it, because again, it just kind of got stuck in my craw. I've been thinking about it. And yet this is just like one of those funny moments where he's giving a really complex answer to what I think is maybe otherwise a really simple question. It's like, if I had heard those arguments, I wouldn't be in the position that I'm in. So of course, the arguments that I have heard have led me to my current position. But I am still open to hearing more arguments. Again, I sort of began this quest as an objective person. I believe I still am an objective person. Somebody could give me evidence that I'm not. But my objective quest and search for truth led me to Christianity. It's not some other way around. Like, I found Christianity and I want it to be true. And now I've built all this. I've built the defense. I've built my case. I've built a wall around me to keep me safe so that nobody threatens my ideas. It's like, the truth is, Christianity is hard. I mean, it is hard. I mean, this is something that Joe has touched on a little bit, and that has come up a little bit earlier. You accepted Christianity because it made your life better, and or something like that. And of course, Steve kind of agrees, because that's true. You accepted Christianity, and it has made life better. In some way, that is actually true. But in another way, it's incredibly difficult. There's a part of you, there's a part of me at least, and I do see this in other Christians. It's like, I am kind of a reluctant convert. Like, it's not easy. Christianity asks you to die to yourself. That's what it's asking of you. And that death is painful. You're dying to the worldly, fleshly nature that resides within you because of the fall and rebellion against God, and the sin that has permeated all of creation and all of human history. And it is hard. Like, that is a struggle. It is a battle. We've already looked at Ephesians 6, So there is a sense that, yes, I've accepted Christianity. Christianity has made my life better, and that much more difficult. I believe it was G.K. Chesterton that said, for the Christian, all the central questions of life have been answered, but all the peripheral questions of life are yet unanswered. you're stuck wondering, am I doing this right? Am I living faithfully to God? But for the non-Christian, all the peripheral questions might be answered. Okay, I can go do this job and I can go, make money and do all that. But the central questions still have not been answered. Where did I come from? Where am I going? Who made this possible? So that was something that just earlier we never got to touch on. But it's worth saying. It's worth saying that yes, Christianity has made life better / far more difficult and harder to manage.
What I found in my PhD research was that when people investigate questions of origins, they're investigating questions that have both a scientific and a philosophical dimension. There's evidence that bears on the question, but whatever conclusion they draw is going to have larger implications for philosophy and worldview. If you can show that life arose by an completely undirected chemical evolutionary process, you're going to be more inclined toward a more materialistic worldview. You're going to say matter and energy are sufficient to explain how everything got here. If, as I think, the evidence of digital code in the DNA molecule and a complex information storage and processing system and those nifty developmental gene regulatory circuits I was telling you about, if those kinds of phenomena in life point, as I think they do, to a mind, a pre-existing mind, after all, it takes a programmer to make a program, and if we've got something like software program in DNA, we're looking at a strong indicator of a mind. If that's a good argument, then that has different metaphysical implications. That's going to point more in a theistic direction.
And that's all part of the first video that I did on this, or the first podcast that I did on this.
When we're talking about metaphysical, we're just talking about things we can't measure. But it might be because we don't have the capacity to measure them. It might not be because they don't exist. We're very limited. So which brings me to this question. If we are the product of design, if the universe is the product of design, are we the ultimate expression of that design?
Can I come back to that, but first make one more point about the metaphysical science divide?
Sure.
Because I think it's really important. Metaphysics is the subject in philosophy of being. What is the case?
Mm-hmm.
Science is concerned about what is the case. And so that there would be an overlap between those two concerns is not unexpected, to separate them entirely. And when people say, well, I'm not going to consider that because it's not scientific, they might be making a deep intellectual error. Because let's illustration. If I go into the British Museum and I look at the inscriptions on the Rosetta Stone, and I study them for a bit and realize, 3 different languages with the same message. When the archaeologists figured out what was going on, they realized, these are inscriptions. These were produced by a scribe, by an intelligence. They did not arise by wind and erosion or some materialistic forces. In other words, they were looking at evidence that compelled the conclusion of an intelligent designer. Now, if I hold strictly to the rule, I'm only going to look at what I regard as science, and what I regard as science limits itself to strictly materialistic explanations, I may encounter evidence that's pointing towards the reality of a mind, and I'm not going to be able to see it because I've put philosophical blinders on my inquiry.
Okay, so his point here is like, if you look at language on the Rosetta Stone, it naturally takes you into a metaphysical conclusion that there is a mind, there's consciousness that produced that language, that engraved that language, those words onto that stone. We do the same thing with the evidence in nature. It's like we're looking at the evidence, and yes, it takes us into the metaphysical realm, which a lot of scientists don't like. But of course, that's where the science and philosophy overlap. A lot of scientists are doing poor philosophy by putting those blinders on.
I've limited the range of hypotheses that I'm willing to consider before I've even looked at the evidence. And I think that's what's been going on. The main objection we get to intelligent design is this claim it's not science because it's not materialistic. And sometimes people will justify that by saying, well, it's not science because the thing you postulate is unobservable. And that's a connection to the comment you made a minute ago. But science is full of unobservable elements. Science works by inferring. It has an indirect method of inference. We often infer unobservable things, quarks, physical fields, subterranean geological structures, states of mind, from evidence that we can observe or see. We infer from the unobservable to the observable. Well, if you can do that in other branches of in evolutionary biology, we infer past transitional intermediate forms and past mutational events based on things we can see.
That's a good point. I mean, I'd be interested to hear what other explanations are out there for this. Why would people within the realm of science only limit themselves to things that they can, observe when it comes to the idea of the cause for all life? Okay, so we're trying to say, well, like, where did life come from? Some people say, well, it came from God. No, you can't do that because we can't observe that. But in all these other fields of science, we make inference based off of the evidence we do see into the things that we don't see. So what is causing people at the point of God to say, no, we can't do that? No, we can't. That's where we draw the line. We can't infer God or mind. Is it just part of the fall? Is it part of the human condition? We are people in rebellion to our Creator, and so we're resistant to come to that conclusion. So I don't know what other explanations are there.
So the fact that we're positing an unobservable designing intelligence having acted in the past should not disqualify that as being a scientific theory or a legitimate theory of a metaphysical kind, because science and metaphysics often does that very thing. We can't get around that.
Well, I think human beings get very arrogant when they're the disseminators of information and people listen to them on a regular basis, and there's this appeal to authority. I'm the person who explains science, and anything that confuses that or questions that or is an alternative theory gets dismissed. Because if you're right, then I'm wrong, and I'm not willing to do it, and I can just shut you up.
Man, we've experienced that in spades, and some very top people
It's more common than not.
It's super common.
It's just a human inclination, I think, especially when you're encountering a very difficult thing like this. Like, instead of having a long-form discussion or years of debate and years of examination, it's easier just to dismiss and to not have a conversation with that person. And I think that's foolish. I really do, because I think that it's an opportunity. First of all, if you really truly believe what you're saying, it's an opportunity for you to state your point more clearly than the other person.
And this goes to my point of Joe's curious. Joe is curious. He's saying this is the type of thing that needs a long-form discussion. It needs well thought out, long-term, pondering. Ponder these things for a long time. And there he is. I think that he is very curious about these things. I think he's still resistant, of course, probably to something, similar to Stephen's position. But there's a hint. There's more than a hint of curiosity from Joe Rogan, at least that I perceive.
Iron sharpens iron.
Yeah, which is what it's all about. And if you just shut that down, I usually think that you're vulnerable. I generally think that people who shut that down, their ideas are vulnerable.
I agree with that. I've seen that a lot.
I want to go back to the other part of the
Cambridge
question.
supervisor.
Yeah?
High Oxford accent. He said to me, beware the sound of one hand clapping. He said, if there's an argument on one side, there's bound to be an argument on the other. And if there's only one hand clapping, often it's because the person clapping that hand is afraid of what the other hand is going to say.
Interesting.
Yeah.
The other question I had, do you think that human beings are the ultimate expression of this intelligent design?
In this cosmos, I think there is a sense that humans are qualitatively unique in the creation, that we were made as sort of a crowning of the process of creation.
When you say cosmos, how are you defining? What are you defining?
Well, I'll speak as a Christian who also believes that there may be other beings besides human beings that have consciousness. The Bible speaks of angelic beings, for example. I have no direct experience of those, but I have other reasons to believe that the Bible is true, so I take things like that on the authority of the Bible. No experience of them. But of the creatures we know, I think there are qualitative differences between humans and all other forms of animals that make us special. Our ability to use language, for example, our ability to experience humor, our ability to use mathematics, our ability to have conversations like this one.
No, can I stop you right there?
Yeah.
We know orcas have a very complex language. We know dolphins have very complex language.
Love dolphins.
We know monkeys experience humor.
Sanctification. I'm just going to throw that out there. Sanctification. what is it actually that makes humans unique? If I'm just looking at from almost like as much of a materialistic perspective as I can see that humans are unique because I don't see anywhere else in the natural realm where other animals are wrestling with morality the way humans wrestle with morality and have historically wrestled with morality. No other creature in the animal kingdom wrestles with this seemingly dual nature. We're at war within ourselves. We want to do good and we don't. And we are aware of that. So I would say that, and again, this does touch on sort of Christianity. It's sin and redemption are the things that I see that make humanity unique within the story of creation, within God's story. And so that process is that sanctification process, working out your salvation, allowing God to transform you, allowing the Word of God to transform the way you think, allowing God to give you new desires that are contrary to your old desires, that are selfless. And that would be something that I just see. Now, of course, do you see that sometimes in the animal kingdom, like that selflessness, selfless acts? You do see that. It's really interesting. But do animals wrestle with the moral question and discernment of that morality the way human beings wrestle? That's my take. I know we're here for Joe and Stephen, but that's my take.
Do they tell jokes? Don't know.
They joke with each other.
Yeah, there's
They
playfulness.
communicate
and stuff. Yeah.
with sounds.
Yeah.
We know that they have sounds for
Yeah.
different animals and sounds for predators.
Have they ever composed a sonnet?
I think that the studies of human language show that a 3-year-old human can do things that the best chimp just. There's a qualitative difference in the way we use language, in the complexity of the language forms, and
Sure.
Chomsky's universal grammar idea.
But you know that chimpanzees are, in fact, even better at solving some puzzles with rewards for food than humans.
Sure.
Than young humans.
I think there's a Skinnerian account of animal behavior that's pretty good. I think there's a not good. I think the Skinnerian account of human language was pretty much refuted by Chomsky in the 60s, and I think there's something much deeper going on with human language. It's not an area of particular expertise, but my colleague David Berlinski is very interested in this and has corresponded with Chomsky over the years. And he told a story about Chomsky at a conference that I attended, where he said that Chomsky was at one point very openly skeptical about Darwinian accounts of the origin of language, and then was later sort of pressured to walk some of that skepticism back. And but he said, okay, language could have evolved, but there would have had to have been sort of a pre-existing universal grammar that allowed people to make sense of all the to develop a symbol convention that would allow communication, and this would have had to have arisen very, very abruptly. It couldn't have gradually emerged.
Why?
I'm just telling the story for now,
Right?
Because I'm not an expert on the origin of language. But Berlinski finished the story and said, "Well, that's great, Noam, but why not then call that what it sounds like, which is a miracle? You have this. Here's the problem, I think, as I understand it. If we've got just tapping and scratching and pointing, okay. So I say red, 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 and you say okay, red, red, red. So we're going to develop a symbol convention with. Here's the problem: to get a symbol convention going in order to communicate, you need a symbol convention. That's the circularity of it. And the behaviorist idea is, well, maybe we could do that with pointing and grunting, okay, and rewards. That might work for nouns, okay, red, tree, ball, shirt, whatever. But how do you express something like the subjunctive tense with pointing and grunting and rewards? What I would have done is, or the imperative, what I should do is that all human languages have these multiple tenses. It's something really striking. They're in all languages. And it's very hard to imagine how you could express that subtlety conveyed by those tenses without already having the universal grammar or those language structures built into the brain.
This is really interesting because, and it's somewhat complicated, I guess, at the same time. But there's still a redness that needs to be expressed, right? That's the idea. Yes, you could say that the word red is just agreed upon, and what some people call red, we might call blue or whatever. But there's still a redness that's objective in reality that needs to be described. And so that's one level, and then the other level of it is just that language becomes more and more complex. We're communicating very complex ideas, and that cannot be the result of an evolutionary process. You have to have some foundation to get started with. And so you have this in Genesis. That Adam names all the creatures. And so that's language. That's Adam coming up with linguistics, being able to use the full capacity of his mind to create language, and not only create language, but describe what's going on in the world. And yet he doesn't start that in a vacuum, because God created from his word. God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. In the beginning was the Word was with God. I'm going to find the verse here really quick. Yeah, Genesis 2:20. The man gave names to all the cattle and to the birds of the sky and to every beast of the field. But yet for Adam there was not a helper suitable. It's a really interesting word. It's the co-respond. But that's another podcast for another day. So what we're seeing here in Genesis 2, verse 20, is that Adam has this ability to name all the animals. He has an ability not only to describe the redness of the red thing, but to give names to all the other animals, to do taxonomy, to say, oh, this animal is like that animal, and to give them names. That those names correspond to the reality of that animal. There's an elephantness that needs to be described. So, and of course I'm speaking in English here, so I'm going to use the word elephant because that's my language, and somehow that word conveys the elephantness that we're trying to describe. Yes, some of that is conditioning that we've just come up. We've said, okay, every time you've seen an elephant, you've called it an elephant in the English language, and so it creates that in your mind. But yet there's still an elephant there in reality that needs to be described, and Adam is able to do that with these animals. But of course he was able to do it because he begins in a world that was created by the Word of God. So here I am as a Christian, and I think that explains things. And what Meyer is saying is that an evolutionary process could not explain what we have in language. So again, it's so multifaceted. It's in DNA, it's in language, it's in history. I mean, it's just all over the place. And so I think with that, I am going to have to pump the brakes on this one. And I don't know if I will come back to the Joe Rogan, Stephen Meyer interview. If you want to, let me know. If it's like we need to do, there's an hour and 4 minutes left. Let me know if you made it this far into the video. I love you. I'm glad you're here. If you're listening on the podcast, of course, I've got, I do the links and stuff like that in the YouTube description. And so any links that I'm sharing are over there. You can check out the video there and give me a, thumbs up and comment and share this with your friends. Because again, the purpose of this podcast is to have meaningful conversation around what I think is the most important thing, which is theology, what comes into our mind when we think about God. It will determine how we live the rest of our lives. So I'm glad that you're here. I'm glad that you're considering those things. And if there's other people that you know that would benefit from this conversation, share this far and wide. I'm not sure how happy YouTube is with me, so I'm not sure what kind of algorithmic help I get. But I have been really, really happy with this community as we build it and grow. And again, unfortunately, just a little bit of a time crunch for me today. And that's where we're going to have to end it. I think that's a great place to end it. Like the word, we're ending with the word. And again, let me know if you want to see more of this. We'll see. If I'm still thinking about it a couple days from now, I might just pop back on and see what the I guess it's the final third. It's a 3-hour long podcast. Maybe we do 3 videos on it. Maybe we do 3 episodes on it. So thanks for being here. Catch you in the next one.